Viewers, you're watching yet another edition of The World Tomorrow as part of our series as we prepare to welcome 2022. India and China are today locked in a high-stakes geopolitical great game. As India rises to take its place alongside other world powers and looks to extend its influence beyond its borders, it has come up against the great Chinese wall. Beijing is anything but happy about India's emergence. In fact, it has begun to look to aggressively contain India. It has stitched alliances with India's arch enemy, Pakistan. It makes untenable territorial claims. It has begun to transgress into India, and it unleashes cyber war to fan the fires of societal mistrust and instability. India has responded by exposing China's dirty tricks in international fora and sticking together with other world powers. Also, it has entered into regional alliances in the hope of deterring China. But India has also learnt that diplomacy has its limitations and has now embarked upon an ambitious military modernization program. Remember, India is perhaps the only country in the region that has had a full-scale war with China. All this means that the relationship between Delhi and Beijing is now acquiring a more confrontational character. The question is, can tensions escalate into full-scale conflict? And we're going to open this up this evening and speak with individuals who really need no introduction. Let me first begin with General G.D. Bakshi. General Bakshi, it has become customary for every new Army, Navy or Air Force chief who takes over to say that we are prepared for a two-front war. The insinuation is not anymore a war with Pakistan, but with China as the added player. I want to ask you, first of all, do you believe that these fears of an all-out conflict are exaggerated?
Rahul, I do not think these fears are exaggerated because the simple fact is that China is on a collision course. China started this COVID. I am quite firmly convinced with the data on hand that COVID was, formulated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology and spread as a deliberate biological Pearl Harbor kind of a thing to destabilize all antagonists. And then she became aggressive on all fronts, whether in the East China Sea against Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and in Ladakh. The incursion in Ladakh had a purpose. After the Balakot incident, India had crossed the international border, sent 12 Mirages across and bombed across the IB, not the line of control. And that had shaken up Pakistan. Whatever it might have said to the contrary, it had shaken up Pakistan, and for 22 months it had lain quiet. To my mind, the Ladakh intrusions had a pattern. The pattern was to encourage Pakistan to resume asymmetric warfare against India, which for 22 months after Balakot had gone into cold storage. To encourage Pakistan that we will take care of the Indian Army, go ahead with your asymmetric destabilization. And post Ladakh, we find that has resumed. Pakistan firstly did the coup de grace in Kabul, having consolidated Kabul, which is now turning attention on Jammu and Kashmir with a renewed vigor. And that is primarily because of the, encouragement, abetment given by China. However much we may wish to avoid conflict, there are further grounds for conflict coming up in the so-called water wars. Tibet is the water tower of Asia. 9 of 10 major rivers of Asia originate there. The Satluj, the Ganga, the the Yamuna, the Brahmaputra, the Indus, they all originate from Tibet. And if the Chinese are tomorrow in a situation of great water scarcity, which is coming upon us, are going to divert the waters of the Brahmaputra, play around with even run-of-the-water dams, which could change this flow in winter, there will be more than adequate cause for conflict. We are on a collision course.
Okay, we are on a collision course.
And we might as well prepare.
And we may as well prepare.
We are going to face an Armageddon.
Okay.
And we may as well be prepared for it.
That's a dire picture. How quick? We'll come to that a little later. But let me open this up further. We also have, of course, with us Kenneth Juster. As I said, to most Indians, he's very well known. He was the former US ambassador to India. He's also a distinguished fellow, Council of Foreign Relations. Mr. Juster, you've been here in India when some of the border transgressions have taken place. You were here at the height of the Galwan tension, the face-off in eastern Ladakh. Not very pleasant. You know that India moved very quickly, in fact, to try and impose some sort of costs on China, economically, etc. But you've also been a great votary of diplomacy, saying that, look, talk it out, work it out. There's enough at stake for this to spill into conflict. Do you still believe this, or is your perspective changing?
First of all, it's good to see you again, Rahul, and thank you for having me today. I don't think that either country wants to have a military conflict. It may ultimately happen through miscalculation, or some change of position, but right now I don't think that's the case. It's still not clear what China's objective was in amassing its troops on India's northern border. Was it to protest against India's building of permanent infrastructure on its side of the line of actual control? Was it to try to gain new grounds that they felt were strategic in that area? Was it try to send India a message that it's getting too close to the United States? Whatever the situation, it didn't succeed. Perhaps China felt that by amassing its troops and artillery on the border, it could win a war without having to fight a war. But India quickly responded, got its own troops and artillery in place, and there's been a standoff. And at this point, each side is digging in, so this crisis is by no means over, and it could potentially go in a negative direction militarily. What India needs to do is carefully mix shows of a showing of strength toward China, and it's done that, I think, by accelerating its involvement in the Quad with Australia, the United States, and Japan, but also not do anything so provocative as to engender a military response from the Chinese. I think one of the important things that people are perhaps not focusing on right now is what happens between Russia and Ukraine. India has a very strong interest in not seeing Russia violate Ukraine's territorial integrity because the Chinese are watching closely. You saw that Xi and Putin just had a recent summit meeting. And if Russia invades Ukraine, the West gets distracted in the United States by that. China may be emboldened by it. It may see that in its own territorial disputes, it too can violate the sovereignty of other countries. And that would not be good. So it's very important, I think, that India, along with the Quad countries, take notice of that situation and reiterate the importance of settling disputes peacefully, following the rule of law, and most important, enshrining the principle of maintaining the territorial integrity of other states. Beyond that, I can go into a whole host of other steps that I think India and the United States should take to try to avert combat. But I would say, finally, at this point, while there may ultimately be some military clashes, we certainly hope that's not the case, the real confrontation is in the economic arena, where China has been very aggressive, not only in terms of its enhanced bilateral trade with all countries in the region, but its Belt and Road Initiative, its joining of regional trade agreements such as the Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and its desire to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And India and the United States need to get a better strategy economically to respond to the Chinese, because that's really the backbone of their broader territorial strategy, in my opinion, even if we can avoid a military conflict.
Very interesting. Okay, so let me bring Andrew Small into this. We're moving now away from a more pragmatic approach to someone who is written a book, The China-Pakistan Axis, India's New Geopolitics, Asia's New Geopolitics. You're a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asian program at the German Marshall Fund of the US. We've had General Bakshi, who says conflict inevitable. We have a slightly more measured point of view from Kenneth Juster, who says that, look, it's a tightrope walk and both sides will perhaps think better of all-out provocations. Not that they may not happen, but through trade and other agreements and engagements, we can mitigate. Andrew Small, I want to ask you, the Pakistan-China axis, what is really the aim of this axis? Is it just to contain India? And if it is, how much will they be prepared to stake to do so?
So the China relationship with Pakistan was originally India-centric in nature, and that still provides the kind of foundational glue for the two sides. They continue to see mutual advantage in being able to coordinate with each other in their dealings with India, and particularly on China's side, to bolster Pakistani capabilities in order to have India tied down on its western borders. That's been the enduring aspect of the relationship. China's always been careful, though, about being drawn into this kind of two-front war scenario if it's one that's precipitated by Pakistan. They learned the lessons in the 60s and 70s about the willingness of Pakistan to take certain risks that China found unacceptable, and so they've kind of moved for a long time into something that looked more like almost a giant procurement relationship. They wanted to give the capabilities that Pakistan needed, particularly on the nuclear side, and as time has gone on, the PLA has not become the most important supplier of conventional weapons, but has really become the full spectrum military supporter of Pakistan up and down the line. But there's still been a degree of carefulness on China's part about any sort of scenario in which the two were drawn into conflict at the same time. I think there's still been an attempt to separate this out. We have, though, moved into a very different phase of this. We know across the board in Chinese foreign policy, there is almost nothing that can be taken for granted when it comes to traditional principles, traditional precepts, traditional limitations on this. So we do have to think differently even about the questions of how China might use its relationship with Pakistan in some of these scenarios. It used to be that the two sides did not militarily coordinate planning when it came to scenarios that might involve India. China's changing its security relationships with a number of countries when it comes to these sorts of scenario planning. I think we do have to look quite differently now about the kinds of risks that China might be willing to take in two-front scenarios in a way that does look different before.
Okay, that's interesting. General Bakshi, you, of course, fought counterinsurgency in Kashmir, so no one better actually to talk a little bit about this, because Pakistan has invested heavily in transgressing the LOC. And now, of course, you have China on another front, making these runs into Indian territory and sometimes trying to squat and create problems and at least precipitate some sort of a standoff. Now, if I got Andrew Small right, he says that push comes to shove, China may not actually back Pakistan if it draws India into some sort of a conflict. Do you share this, or do you believe that the Chinese now are not going to sit on the fence?
Look, the simple fact is that for a long time, the commonly held perception was that the arena of conflict of India and China will be in Arunachal Pradesh, where they are laying claims to the whole province and very prickly about any Indian leader visiting there, you know. But I had at that stage, as far back as 2015, clearly made out a prognostication that China would shift the theater towards Ladakh. They are making a smokescreen in the east, make an uproar in the east, strike in the west. That is precisely what came to pass. The incursion came not in Arunachal in the east, but in Ladakh, where the Chinese and Pakistanis can cooperate to put military pressure on India. At the very least, they are already they are encouraging, they have encouraged Pakistan to resume the asymmetric war against India in Jammu and Kashmir. And if India, the only way India can stop it is by retaliating across the line of control or across the international border, as we did in Uri and as we did in Balakot. It is for that China has jockeyed to put itself in position to be able to mount military pressure, tangible military pressure in Ladakh at a time when India is contemplating some action to put an end to Pakistan's 30 years of constant asymmetric provocations. You know, that could escalate without even a major conflict being, thought of by any side. That could easily trip over and escalate, number one. I do agree with my co-panelists that, China wants to have a single strategic direction. That direction right now is towards the East Coast, towards Taiwan, towards the United States, perhaps South China Sea. All that means the United States, right? But the simple fact is that China is undergoing a lot of domestic turbulence. Don't forget, China had attacked India in 1962, with a limited war, which, it kept very well under control. It escalated the conflict at will, de-escalated at will, So they want to do something similar to teach India a lesson, to keep India tied down in South Asia so that it doesn't arise as an Asian competitor. And when China is facing turbulence at home, don't forget in 1962, the great leap forward had faced. Mao Zedong was facing a lot of domestic turbulence and he decided to divert attention. That time also there was a conflict between the United States and Russia and the Soviet Union then over Cuba. So if there is a conflict going to escalate over Ukraine, it may be the window of opportunity China is looking for to give a kind of a dressing down to India, to cut it down to size before it gets too big. Because when a Russia, United States, Ukraine conflict takes place, it provides a window of opportunity rather similar to 1962 when Cuba had tied down the United States. But the simple fact is, of course, India is much stronger, much, much stronger. The only fact is that our military modernization should have proceeded much faster. It has been badly delayed. And will China try and exploit that? Will China try and stymie that? Will China try and exploit that window of opportunity before India really gets too strong for it to try a misadventure, even a local limited conflict?
Well,
that is what we have to worry about in the short term.
Okay.
In the long term, we have to worry about the problems with river diversions. That will force you to fight, whether you want to or you don't want to. If Assam is going to be devastated by the floods of the Brahmaputra, well, can you just keep quiet and take that lying down? You will have to kinetize the conflict, even if China does not.
Well, that's an interesting, of course, scenario, and that will tie in with other challenges like global warming and what, of course, China plans to do with trying to shore up its own water reserves. And there are lots of rivers that flow into India from China, and some of those today are being actively interceded by China. But let me just bring back the conversation to the possibility of a conflict. Can it just a conflict in today's world between a hegemon and perhaps another nation where one particular side, without provocation, wants to go in because it has to fulfill some territorial ambitions, would be a supreme violation of international law. How certain can India be that the international community will move very quickly? After all, there are two nuclear weapon powers here. A third, if you count Pakistan, will be quick to sort of bring order. Can we count on the other world powers to do so? Or will we see a situation that happened in the 60s?
Well, I think in order to really address that question, what needs to happen now is some very candid contingency planning by India. It needs to look at what are the potential worst areas, including what you just said, a possible invasion. And it needs to do tabletop exercises for two purposes. One, to see how it will coordinate internally across its three services, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, which, as you know, are not integrated. This was something that General Rawat was working on before his tragic death earlier this month, but also how it would coordinate externally. And if, in fact, India wants to have the United States come to its assistance, you have to start talking about that now. You have to start having joint planning. You have to discuss training. You have to discuss what possible weaponry it would need. Because it cannot happen once the invasion occurs. You need much more lead time for that. So these types of discussions, which India has for a variety of reasons been reluctant to engage in to date, maybe they are since I left office, but this is what has to take place. And again, some of that may want to be visible to the Chinese, so that shows a potential strength between India and the United States. Some of it may want to be more closed, so it doesn't unnecessarily provoke the Chinese. But this sort of contingency planning, thinking about worst case scenarios, and discussing what responses that certainly the United States would support India diplomatically. Certainly we provide information sharing. Certainly we try to provide some material support. But if you're really talking about sophisticated hardware, that needs to have a lot of discussion and thought before it were to occur. And ultimately, it gets to the question that has also been addressed. India's military has not fully modernized yet. Ultimately, they want to be able to produce equipment indigenously. But until they're able to do that, they've got to be strategic about what items they purchase. And in my view, the strongest partner they would have in any such conflict would be the United States. And you're going to want to have interoperability in certain areas, such as perhaps jet fighters, where the Indian military should want to purchase some U.S. jet fighters that would enable it to operate in a more coherent way. But these planning issues have to begin now in terms of strategy and coordination.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's been an enlightening discussion. There's lots to think about. Also for the government, of course. We leave it at this. We'll be right back with yet another episode, another very interesting subject. Don't go away.